It'll be tricky for them to do Medicare. I mean, I think that at least what I read, in the press, is that I think the OMB director, I'm going to mispronounce his name,
Mulvaney, yeah.
Apparently had been interested in doing Medicare, and the president pushed back and said that he didn't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that this year it's something that's going to be taken up by Congress. It's just too difficult for them to do. For next year, I guess anything's possible. The thing that I think a lot of folks are paying attention to is the Independent Payment Advisory Board determination, which will happen at some point this summer. We don't know exactly when, but I think if anything happens on Medicare within the congressional realm, it's going to be if there is a trigger from the AHIP determination, and that's probably going to be determined. The Office of the Actuary, which does the trustees report, Medicare trustees, but it's really the Office of the Actuary at CMS, they'll make that determination, I think, at some point this summer it will come out. So that might, trigger some additional discussion and activity around that. So that seems to be something, I think, within the Medicare world, from the congressional perspective, that I could see potentially happening or getting some attention. I think it has to do with Congress feeling as if, it's their role to, I think that's part of it, because Congress feels that it's their role to make those determinations about how to address Medicare spending. And they don't want that to sort of be taken away from them.
Right.
They think it's sort of incorporated congressional responsibility to make the determinations and not have it be made by a separate board. And the board itself has never actually been named. That sort of shows how politically radioactive it's been. But if the trigger does happen, then I think the law requires the Secretary of HHS to send over recommendations to Congress, and if Congress doesn't act, then those become law.
And that trigger would remind me again what that would be.
So it's basically there's a target rate, and there's a target growth rate, and there's a Medicare growth rate or something to that effect. And if there's if Medicare, is growing faster than this target, and the target is essentially the Consumer Price Index, urban, and Price Index medical. So it's a 5-year average, but I think in general, the way I understand it is, if Medicare growth is faster than sort of inflation target or CPI, then this trigger happens, and it's done sort of do it for 1 year. So the issue is it going to be triggered for 2017, which means, and then there's kind of this delay. So then you make the determination, and it's maximized. The maximum is 1.5%. So, and that's sort of the difference between. So if one number is, let's say, 5.1%, the other one is these are made up numbers. But let's say it's 5.1%, the other one is 5.2%, then it's 0.1% or something like that. And so then 0.1% of Medicare overall spending is what they would have to achieve. And hospital spending, at least until the next few years, is hospice spending is exempt from those reductions. And the statute specifically mentions Medicare Advantage and Medicare Part D, but it doesn't explicitly exclude physician payments or other preference payments. Well, I guess I can't really comment explicitly on the lawsuits themselves, but I think in general, there's sort of this, they're just sort of looking at what's happened. So, CMS has looked at doing risk adjustment data validation audits. They've done them, and they, had proposed several years ago having sort of, extrapolating those results for the entire plan. And then meanwhile, there's sort of the guidance about, what plans can and can't do is, and I think that's part of what the cases talk about. It's been a little bit unclear. So I don't know. It's a complicated area. I think it's something that, I'm not sure if I think sometimes the way it gets talked about, it looks at sort of it's sort of looking at it through a fee-for-service lens, where, in the fee-for-service world, you get paid per service, and, so if there's a service that's provided that's, an error, that's a challenge. Whereas risk adjustment is more complicated. You have a risk adjustment model. You have the likelihood that the diagnosis code was actually going to be, an error on the fee-for-service side, and that's all kind of baked into the model. And then you have plans that are projecting their risk scores as part of their bids. They're also at risk for the full payment. So it's I think it gets kind of complicated. Sometimes it gets, I think, sort of brought into a very oversimplified, and it just looks at,
Right.
the MA, there's this problem around MA, and it doesn't really take into account all the nuances of the way MA payment works. But I think it's definitely an area that obviously is going to continue to get attention. Right, I think there's the importance of compliance, but I think an important point to make is part of this as well is that, in the fee-for-service world, that's what I was talking about, they're not, the diagnosis codes aren't sort of, as important for how they get reimbursed. So there's sort of less, I think there's less accuracy in the fee-for-service world, and the MA world, I think, pays more attention to that. And, I think by getting more accurate codes, it leads to, more accurate treatment for members. So, the identifying diagnosis codes in and of itself is part of providing treatment, part of the way plans are providing treatment. So, I think there's, so there's a hearing, I guess that's tomorrow, so we submitted information. I believe it was submitted in support of that, but SNP reauthorization is a high priority, so the special needs plans are scheduled to expire at the end of next year, but really it's reauthorization needs to happen by the end of this year, just for the contracts to work that the plans have. I think a lot of the pieces of Chronic Care Act, we support of, whether it's, providing more flexibility for plans to vary benefits around the UDID model, allowing telehealth to be, a basic benefit. I think what else is in the Chronic Care Act that, we think would be beneficial. And there's telehealth, there's uniform benefit. Oh, I'm sorry. There's also this issue about kind of what non-medical benefits and being able to use those as supplemental benefits. So I think a lot of those provisions that are in the Chronic Care Act we support and we'd like to see move forward. Generally being able to coordinate care in a way and using, as well as using innovative payment arrangements with providers, whether it's, just different kinds of risk-sharing arrangements that they have. So those are the kinds of activities, just, and, general, just kind of population management in a way that, they're focused on doing that. And, as we've seen, the program has gotten larger and larger and continues to grow from an enrollment perspective. So I think beneficiaries are definitely making decisions with their feet. There's always the trust fund limits with that, but I think the macro, all the different value-based incentives that are there for the physicians and how that's going to work with Medicare Advantage. I think that's a key issue. So I think in the first couple of years, it's not recognized as Medicare Advantage would be recognized as an alternative payment model.
Right.
And I know there's been some support for doing that and changing that. I think that's definitely an area that